So as you can see, we just finished up with getting lights in our van and power to our outlets.
Which means we can finally do this.
Okay, running thin on these intro ideas. Look, we're in a garage, and that's because the van is in a shop right now getting a water pump fixed that was already fixed by that same shop. I guess they put one in and it didn't work, and so it's still there. And now we're here in Julie's garage, which we will only have for another week before we move and we leave Colorado. So there's a lot going on right now, and we still have to get a video out. So this is where we're at.
Where's our next home, Ben?
We don't know. The road. We're gonna finish the van back in Indiana and then go. We're gonna take off. We don't really have a solid plan quite yet. So we have decided to break our electrical install into 3 separate parts. And I know that's annoying. You're gonna probably have to go through the channel once they're all uploaded to find everything. But it really like rips my soul apart when I have to cut together an hour-long video within like a week or 2. So we are going to do our AC and DC wiring within the van for this video. And then we'll do a second video that's gonna cover the main like electrical components, including our batteries, our inverter, and all the other ways we're gonna charge our batteries and power our system. And then we'll finish it off with just focusing on our solar setup. So buckle in, we got a lot of information to share.
Now, when you plan out your build, you're gonna wanna make a list of all the components that you're gonna be installing in your van that will require power or electricity. And depending on your budget and your build out, some of those items are gonna run off either a 12-volt direct current or a 120-volt alternating current, like you would see in your house.
Now, we're not gonna spend a whole bunch of time trying to explain the difference between 12-volt DC and 120-volt AC because we're not electricians, but if you're curious to dive more into the subject, I'll include some links within the description that you can click on. Okay, so now the majority of the items you plan on powering within your van are probably gonna run off of 12-volt DC. And depending on how simple your build is, that might be all you have to worry about. But if you think you're gonna run, say, an AC fridge, or you have things you need to charge like a phone and a computer, or you need to power items like a blender or a TV, you're gonna have to install some outlets, which means you have to start thinking about AC wiring. So to give you an idea of all the items we had to power within our van, our list included
Lights, fans, a cell booster, a fridge, water pump, a toilet, a heating system, and an air cooler, which would all run off of 12-volt DC. Then as far as the AC goes, we planned on running a blender, a projector, an Xbox, and we needed a way to charge our phones, computers, and camera equipment. In order to run or charge all of those items, we would need a few 120-volt outlets installed within the van. So we decided to install 5 in various locations.
So you can see this kind of takes a lot of pre-planning.
All right, so now that you know what you plan on powering within the van, it's time to get a few items together.
You'll need a wire stripper / cutting tool and a wire crimper, and I have a cheap all-in-one guy. You also want a heat shrink wire connector kit since you'll be using a lot of these throughout your install. It probably doesn't hurt to have a heat shrink kit as well, and a heat gun to shrink those, or a hairdryer or a lighter or a blowtorch, whatever.
A match.
Yeah, you can hold a match to it if you want. You'll also want some conduit or split loom in various sizes. We use some 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, and 1 inch. And then you want some zip ties and a straight blade. It also helps to have some wire fish tape for those hard to reach places when running your wire. Now, if you want to get fancy, you can also get some ferrules and a ferrule crimping tool, but we'll talk about that more toward the end of the video.
All right, so the last thing you'll want to snag is the wire. And it's important that you get the right size and length. So some more pre-planning is involved.
There's a couple references online that you can use in order to figure out the proper gauge of the wire, and it's up to you on how much of it you're gonna need. The charts online show how long a wire at a certain gauge can be depending on the amount of amps you need to power the item you're connecting to. Now, all your connections are gonna end up at a distribution panel, whether you get one that's for your AC and a separate one for your DC connections, or you get one that combines the two like we did. But you need to figure out how far you're gonna have to run wire to the item you're powering, which means you're gonna have to do a little more research to figure out how many amps your items require and how far you're gonna have to make a connection from your fuse panel. For all your 12-volt DC components, you'll probably be fine with a 14-gauge wire since most of your connections won't be needing more than 10 amps, and the connections won't be over 30 feet in length, especially if you have like a shorter wheelbase van. And you can also design your layout to house all of your connections within the center of your van so that the distance from the front of your van to your panel and the distance from the back of your van to your panel are about the same. Does that make sense?
We ended up buying 250 feet of 14-gauge marine-grade duplex wire that's stranded in tin copper, which is what you want for a home that moves in various climates.
You know, you're shaking around and you're sweating.
That's sweating.
Breathing on your armpit.
We also snagged 25 feet of the same stuff in 12-gauge for an extra long run that we had. Now when it comes to AC wires, you'll be needing some 3-wire, and we ended up going with 60 feet of the 10-3 triplex marine wire, which is also stranded tin copper, which was plenty for our 20 amp non-critical circuit.
It was kind of overkill. I just wanted to make sure we had enough length because we weren't exactly positive on all the locations of our outlets within the van.
Better safe than sorry.
Okay, so now that you've got all your supplies, it's time to figure out where and how you want to run all your wires through your van. By now, you should know where you're going to be placing your lights and your fans and your fridge, and you'll probably know where you're going to put your fuse panel. We knew that all of our connections were going to have to end up somewhere between our rear wheel wells. So we needed to figure out how to get all of our wires, including the ones running through our ceiling for, say, our fans and lights, down through the walls to the floor.
Now when it comes to running your wires through the ceiling, you can keep everything nice and tidy by using zip ties and connecting them directly to the van ribs.
All right, so I am now loosely setting zip ties, kind of as guides for our wires. And then once we're done fishing everything through, then we'll come back and tighten everything down.
For the most part, you can utilize the space in the van walls to run your wires, but there are a few locations that are completely blocked off, and you may need to use a drill or a step-up bit or a hole saw to give yourself some openings and pathways or tunnels.
And this is where Conduit kind of comes in and is important. You don't want your wires to be rubbing up on sharp like metal edges. We made sure once we popped a hole through to add Conduit, whether it was the 1/2 inch, 3/4, or the full inch. Just like that. All right.
There's our window.
There's our channel. This right here, there's no pass through. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna throw a hole through here, put some Conduit, then make a passageway so I can continue through and then feed back down that back column where we already have Conduit fed through. Do that. Got it. And we are gonna have to vacuum all these little loose pieces of metal shrapnel. This little guy, work it through.
Now the biggest hurdle we faced was bringing our ceiling wires down to the floor. Now if you have a Sprinter, there are actually 2 columns on either side of the van by the rear wheel wells that you can run wire through. But it gets a little tight depending on how many wires you gotta run.
Initially, we thought it'd be a good idea to take our Conduit and like pre-feed it through before we put the wires through so we could make like a channel. But because it's split loom, that's what it does, it splits. So when we went to put wire through, it would split and the wire would pop out of the Conduit and then just get stuck and jammed in there. So then we pulled it all back out and figured it was easiest to take our wires, bundle them together, and then wrap the Conduit around it and send it all together in one pull. That's all gotta come through. All right, so we got our first wire. So we usually hit a roadblock right about here. Are you good? You still have Conduit poking at the top?
Yeah, but that's it.
Okay, we did it. It's through. We found out that it was probably about 4 wires wrapped as tightly as we could together with some Conduit around it to be like the maximum that we could fit through without them getting stuck. And those channels have 2 sides, so you can come from like the rear of the van or the front of the van. But you're gonna only be able to get a total of 8 wires, about 8 wires through
each side.
Yeah, and maybe you can get more if you don't use conduit. It was kind of overkill. Maybe you just use conduit at the top and bottom, not through the channel itself. So now that you have all of your tunnels and zip ties up, it's time to start running your wire. And we started with our AC wiring. For our van, all of our outlets were running off a 20 amp circuit, so we just needed to have a wire run from our furthest outlet all the way to our breaker panel. We spliced the wire at each location where we planned on placing an outlet in order to make it easier for us to feed the lines from one location to the next. And I'll show you why it's okay to split it where you plan on putting your outlet later on in the video when I show how we wired our outlets in parallel together. This whole process was pretty easy. It probably only took us about 30 minutes, and then we had all of our AC wiring ran. Then it was on to the DC wiring.
So for the DC wiring, you have a positive and negative wire that you need to run from the panel to the device that you want to power. All you need to do is take a measurement, string out your wire to the appropriate length.
My wingspan is a little over 5 feet here. I'm gonna do that once, twice, 3, almost 4. We only really need about 18 feet, so stopping there. And then I'm gonna cut it and I'm gonna run it.
Just make sure the lengths aren't too long to the point where you're not getting the proper amount of power to your device.
For example, our fan was roughly 17 feet away from our fuse panel, which would make it a 34-foot circuit, and it needed about 5 amps to run. Now, according to the chart, since it's a non-critical circuit, I could run a 14 gauge wire up to 65 feet at 5 amps, so that's good. The only time I felt like I needed to bump up to 12 gauge wire was when I ran our 5 main ceiling lights to a single switch. We had roughly a 30-foot run of wire from our panel all the way to our last light, which meant it was a 60-foot circuit. Honestly, I probably would have been fine, but since I was running 5 lights off a single line, I thought I'd make the main string 12 gauge wire, and then I would tie in each light in parallel using 14 gauge wire. And if that doesn't make sense to you right now, I will try to explain it a bit better later in the video when I show you how we wired everything together.
So I am starting to make labels because we got wires coming out of everything. Out of every office. And it's gonna get really confusing. Where's the space? Okay, so I'm gonna do
Like
driver's side,
DS.
driver's side, bed.
Bed, LED.
Here we go.
She's making moves. Holy cow.
It worked.
You're holding it upside down.
The back will be sticky.
Are you making a terrible decision right now?
Ta-da!
Okay, so once you've got your wires ran, it's time to start connecting them together. So let's start with our outlets.
We ran ours in parallel, which looks a little something like this. So you've got your circuit, which runs from your last outlet to your panel. Then you probably have a couple additional outlets that you'd like to tie into it. Well, as you saw earlier, we had split the wire in every location we planned on placing an outlet. Then we took some of our leftover wire along with our outlet and added a short piece, aka pigtail, of black hot wire, white neutral wire, and green ground wire. And it looked a little something like this. Then we grabbed some wire nuts and tied the outlet into our circuit by tying the 3 black hot wires together, the 3 white neutrals together, and the 3 grounds together. Then we just repeated the process for each outlet until we had a full circuit of 5 outlets.
Now let's talk about our DC connections. Now I personally like to use the quick connects because when you're in a van, you sometimes have to like service an item, and it's a lot easier to just disconnect the item rather than having to split the wire again and then re-strip it and connect it and then heat shrink it and get it running all over again. Anyway, this process is pretty simple. You peel back the sheathing and strip some wire, grab a connector that is going to fit the wire you have, crimp it on, then you can make your connection and heat shrink it. The most difficult DC connections you'll have to do is probably wiring multiple lights to a single switch, so we're gonna show you how we did it. You have your main wire running from your fuse panel through your van, and you wanna tie 5 lights along with a switch. Well, the lights work the same way as your outlets by wiring them in parallel. Strip back some wire from the positive and negative on both sides. Then twist them together, snag a larger connector, and crimp them. Now grab your light, strip back some wire, crimp on a connector, connect them, and shrink. Repeat that for all the lights. Oh, and you can always add an extension with some extra wire if you need to reach a bit further than the length of the wire that comes on the light. Then to add a switch, you'll have to cut into the main line again, and it ties in very similarly. For our dimmer switches, you need to connect positive red wire coming from the panel to the red wire on the switch, and then the red positive line going to your lights to the black wire on the switch. Then you tie your 2 negatives from your main power line together and connect them to the white wire coming from the switch, and it looks like this. Now you have a string of lights, but they need power, which brings us to the fuse panel. We'll go into further detail on how to bring power to your panel from your full system in the next video, but for now, we're just gonna show you how to wire AC and DC wires into it. All right, so our panel houses both our AC and DC connections, but we're gonna start with the DC side. Pop open an entry port and feed your wiring. For our example, we'll be wiring in that string of lights we just connected. You're gonna go through the same process of peeling back the sheathing and stripping your wire. Now, if you're fancy, you can add a ferrule on the end of your wire to make it cleaner, but you don't have to. Then you can connect the positive to an open positive bay and the negative to the negative bus bar. Then you add your fuse, which protects the wiring and the appliance if something goes wrong. If you're unsure of what size fuse you need, I'll include a link to a calculator that you can use to determine the proper size. But once you have that in, you've got power. You see that? Ooh. Then just repeat that for all your DC powered items. Now let's talk about your AC outlets.
You'll again pop another hole into your panel, feed in your wire, and make sure to peel back the sheath and strip your wire. Then you can connect your white neutral to the neutral bus bar and the green ground to the ground bus bar. Then you'll need a type D circuit breaker, and like Ben said, we're running a 20 amp circuit for our outlets. Make sure it's turned off. Then you can connect your black hot wire to the back of the breaker, connect it to the breaker bar, flip that puppy on, and bam, you've got power to your outlets.
And that's it. You have AC and DC wires ran in your van. Now I know this isn't a super detailed tutorial, but it should give you a good idea on how to connect all the components you plan on utilizing in your van. Like I said at the beginning, our next episode will cover all the items in our system that actually provide power to our appliances and how we install them within our van. And there it is.
Whoa. So if you just came across our channel from this, please subscribe and follow along. It helps us keep the channel going, and the more views and comments we get,
The less I feel like I'm just pissing away my time. All right, thanks for watching. Now, go ahead and lick a 12-volt connection and see what it compares to when licking a 9-volt battery. Don't really do that.
endorsing self-harm. It's good, we're gonna get flagged on YouTube.
Bye-bye now.
Okay, bye. So this week, instead of asking you what your favorite ice cream flavor is, we thought we'd share a new up-and-coming artist.
We have somewhat of a small platform, so might as well like try to help others out. And
Spread the love.
I've been trying to like watch TikTok stuff and be cool so I can make TikTok videos, but there's a band on there called Dury, and they're really good. I really like them, and I think you guys should go check them out and help support them because they're kind of up and coming and doing the same stuff we're trying to do with this channel, but with their band. So if you have the time, go check them out. D-U-R-R-Y.
That spells Dury. And if you guys have any new artists of any kind that you want to tip us in
Yeah, let us know.
put it in the comments.